Oil didn't just climb this week. For a moment, it flashed a number that instantly changed the mood of the entire global economy. $119.50 a barrel. That number matters not because it guarantees some instant collapse, and not because every nightmare scenario is suddenly inevitable, but because markets don't wait for shortages to fully arrive before they react. They move on fear, probability, and disruption. And right now, traders are looking at a war that has stretched into day 10, a White House estimate that the fighting could continue for 4 to 6 more weeks, and a supply chain shock that is no longer hypothetical. Iraq has already cut roughly 1.5 million barrels per day as export bottlenecks and storage pressure build. Put those three pieces together, and you get the real story. This is not just about the latest headline spike in oil. It is about what happens when a war keeps going longer than expected, when one of the world's most important energy corridors remains under pressure, and when physical oil starts getting trapped in the wrong places at the wrong time. The question is no longer just, will prices move? They already have. The question now is whether this becomes a brief panic or the early stage of a much larger energy and inflation problem. And that is what makes this moment so important. Because whenever people hear a price like meet $119, the first reaction is usually emotional. Gas stations, inflation, groceries, airline tickets, shipping, electricity. Everything starts racing through people's minds at once. But the better way to understand this story is to slow down and look at the mechanics. What exactly pushed oil that high, even briefly? Why does a White House estimate of 4 to 6 more weeks matter so much? And why is Iraq's production cut such a serious warning signal? Start with the simplest part. Price. Oil briefly hit $119.50 for Brent crude before easing back. Even after pulling down from that intraday surge, it still remained far above the level where markets start to get nervous about broader economic fallout. Once oil gets firmly above $100, the conversation changes. It is no longer just an energy sector story. It becomes a story about inflation, consumer confidence, central banks, transport costs, business margins, and recession risk. That is because oil is not just something drivers buy at the pump. It is one of the key inputs buried inside modern life. It affects trucking, aviation, shipping, farming, petrochemicals, plastics, logistics, manufacturing, and the final price of everyday goods. So, when crude jumps sharply, the market is not only pricing the barrel itself, it is pricing the possibility that a long list of downstream costs may start rising behind it. Now add the second part, time. According to remarks reported from the White House, the administration expected the war could go on for approximately 4 to 6 more weeks. That estimate matters, because time changes everything in an oil shock. A short disruption can cause volatility and stress, but markets often calm if traders believe flows will resume quickly. A longer disruption is different. It starts to affect storage, shipping schedules, insurance, refinery planning, procurement decisions, and government contingency calculations. In other words, 4 to 6 more weeks is not just a number on a calendar. It is a signal to the market that this may not be resolved in a quick burst. And once traders begin to think in weeks instead of days, they stop asking whether the disruption is real and start asking how much worse it could get. That is where Iraq enters the picture. Iraq is not a marginal producer. It is one of the largest oil producers in OPEC and a crucial supplier to Asia and Europe. Reuters, as cited in the reporting you shared, said Iraqi officials reported cuts of nearly 1.5 million barrels per day because storage was filling up and exports were constrained. That is the kind of detail that changes a story from abstract risk to physical stress. It means the problem is not just fear in the futures market. It means barrels are struggling to move, storage is becoming a real limitation, and production is being forced lower because the system cannot clear supply normally. That is an entirely different level of seriousness. A lot of people assume oil shocks happen only when fields are bombed or pipelines explode, but sometimes the disruption happens one step earlier in transport. If producers cannot move crude out fast enough, storage begins to fill. Once storage reaches critical levels, operators may have to cut production even if the wells themselves are still capable of pumping. That is why bottlenecks matter so much. You do not need every facility to be destroyed to create a major supply problem. You only need enough friction in the system that oil stops flowing efficiently from producer to buyer. And that is exactly why the Strait of Hormuz keeps coming up in this story. This narrow waterway is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. Huge volumes of oil move through it every day under normal conditions. When traffic through that corridor becomes dangerous, disrupted, or uncertain, the consequences spread far beyond the Gulf. Shipping delays multiply. Insurance costs jump. Charter rates can move sharply. Buyers worry about delivery reliability. Producers face storage pressure. And markets begin pricing not just current disruption, but the risk of prolonged interruption. That is also why proposals like naval escorts, while important politically, do not instantly solve the problem economically. Even if governments are willing to provide military protection, commercial shipping does not return to normal overnight. Owners, insurers, crews, charterers, and cargo buyers all need confidence that a route is genuinely usable, not just theoretically open. In a war environment, confidence can disappear faster than policy can replace it. So what we are watching is not just a battlefield story, it is a confidence story. Oil at $119 briefly tells you that the market's confidence has been badly shaken. The 4 to 6 week outlook tells you traders think the disruption may persist. Iraq's 1.5 million barrel per day cut tells you physical stress is already showing up in production decisions. Those are 3 separate warning lights flashing at once. And yet, this is where careful analysis matters. A price spike is not the same thing as a permanent shortage. A production cut in one country does not automatically mean the world is about to run out of oil. Markets overshoot, headlines amplify fear, political messaging often gets ahead of actual conditions. So the responsible way to read this moment is not to claim certainty. It is to recognize that the market is pricing a dangerous combination of risk, duration, bottlenecks, and reduced output. That is enough to matter enormously, even without making extreme claims. Now think about the economic chain reaction. If oil stays elevated, transport costs tend to rise. Airlines feel it. Shipping firms feel it. Trucking firms feel it. Manufacturers that rely on petroleum-based inputs feel it. Farmers feel it through diesel and fertilizer-linked costs. Retailers eventually feel it when logistics bills move higher. Consumers feel it last, but they usually feel it everywhere at once. Fuel, tickets, delivery, food, and goods. And the timing could hardly be more sensitive. Many economies have spent the last several years trying to cool inflation without crushing growth. Central banks have been fighting to restore stability after repeated shocks. Households in many countries are already sensitive to prices. Businesses are operating in an environment where margins are tighter and financing costs are higher than they were during the easy money years. So when oil surges, it is not arriving in a calm, resilient global economy. It is hitting a system that is already more fragile than it looks on the surface. That is why markets watch energy prices so closely during wars. Not because every spike becomes a crisis, but because energy has a way of turning geopolitical conflict into everyday economic pain. There is another layer here too, expectations. The White House timeline matters not only for the physical oil market, but for psychology. Businesses make decisions based on expectations. If executives believe the conflict will calm quickly, they are more willing to absorb short-term volatility. If they begin to think the disruption may last over a month, behavior changes. Inventories get reassessed, hedging increases. Purchases may be pulled forward, risk managers become more defensive. That behavior alone can reinforce the price pressure already in the market. So even before the world gets to worst case scenarios, a longer timeline can make the system feel tighter. And notice how the pieces reinforce each other. Higher prices create fear. Fear changes behavior. Behavior tightens markets further. Tighter markets keep prices elevated. Elevated prices feed inflation worries. Inflation worries hit stocks, currencies, bonds, and consumers. This is why oil shocks are rarely just about oil. They become stories about policy, growth, politics, and public mood. If fuel prices rise enough, voters feel it fast. If shipping disruptions persist, importers feel it fast. If producers keep cutting because storage is constrained, refiners feel it fast. And the longer the disruption lasts, the harder it becomes for governments to dismiss the market reaction as temporary noise. Now, there is one more reason Iraq's production cut deserves close attention. It gives the market a concrete number. Vague risk can be ignored for a while. Concrete numbers are harder to ignore. Nearly 1.5 million barrels per day is not a symbolic adjustment. It is large enough to force serious attention, especially in a market already on edge. And the reporting also suggested that more cuts could follow if the disruption persists and storage issues worsen. That possibility matters because the market does not just price what has happened, it prices what might plausibly happen next. This is why even a brief move to $119 can have lasting significance. It tells you the market has already tested a much more alarmed view of the situation. Even if prices retreat from the peak, that peak remains a signal. It shows how quickly fear can reprice the entire energy complex when supply routes and production volumes come under pressure at the same time. And that brings us to the central question. Is this a panic spike that fades, or an early warning of a longer energy squeeze? The honest answer is that nobody can say with certainty yet. But we can say what the market is looking at. It is looking at a war that has continued into day 10. It is looking at reported attacks and disruptions across the region. It is looking at official statements that imply this may continue for weeks, not hours. It is looking at reduced Iraqi output tied to export and storage pressure. And it is looking at one of the most strategically sensitive maritime routes in the world under severe strain. That combination is enough to justify serious concern without crossing into alarmism. And there is a reason the price action itself is so revealing. When traders bid oil sharply higher and then pull back, it often means they are arguing in real time over probability. One side sees disruption but expects stabilization. The other side sees the risk of compounding damage. The result is violent movement. That kind of volatility is not random. It is the market expressing uncertainty over whether this is peaking or spreading. For ordinary viewers, that uncertainty can feel abstract until it reaches household budgets. But for policymakers and companies, it becomes urgent much earlier. They do not wait for the average consumer to notice. They watch freight flows, refinery margins, vessel traffic, inventories, charter markets, and production decisions. And right now, several of those indicators are pointing in the same direction: elevated stress. That does not mean collapse. It does not mean certainty. It does mean risk has become tangible. The safest way to frame this is also the strongest editorially, because it respects the facts. The market is telling you that disruption is real. The reporting is telling you that the war may last longer than many hoped. Iraq's output cut is telling you the transport bottleneck is now affecting actual production. And the brief jump to $119 is telling you how quickly this can escalate in financial terms, if confidence erodes further. So when people ask, why did oil spike so hard? The answer is not one headline. It is the accumulation of pressure. Pressure from war duration, pressure on shipping, pressure on storage, pressure on production, pressure on inflation expectations, pressure on governments to respond, pressure on businesses to prepare. That is what turns a spike into a warning. And this is where your audience needs clarity, because a lot of coverage either oversimplifies or overdramatizes. One side acts as if every move in oil is just market noise. The other side jumps straight to collapse narratives. The truth sits in the middle. Markets are reacting to a genuinely serious supply chain threat, but the outcome still depends heavily on duration, shipping conditions, and whether more production gets forced offline. That middle ground framing is not weaker, it is more credible. And credibility matters, especially in a story like this where viewers can sense immediately when a creator is exaggerating. So here's the cleanest way to understand this moment. Oil briefly touched a level that signals intense market stress. The White House's reported 4 to 6 week view tells traders this may not end quickly. Iraq's 1.5 million barrel per day cut shows that the disruption is already affecting physical output. And as long as those three conditions coexist, energy markets are likely to remain jumpy, sensitive, and vulnerable to further spikes. That matters whether you trade commodities or not. It matters if you run a business that ships products. It matters if you buy groceries. It matters if you book flights. It matters if your country imports energy. It matters if your central bank is still trying to control inflation. And it matters if your government is betting that time will calm the situation. Because time may do the opposite. If flows improve, if confidence returns, and if production stabilizes, this could gradually cool. But if the conflict drags on, if transport stays constrained, and if more producers start cutting because storage or exports are blocked, then the spike we just saw may end up looking less like an anomaly and more like a preview. And that is the key takeaway. The market is no longer reacting only to fear. It is reacting to the first signs of physical strain. That is why Iraq's cut matters so much. That is why the 4 to 6 week timeline matters so much. And that is why a brief move to $119 matters so much. Not because the worst outcome is guaranteed, but because the market has started to price the possibility that this war is becoming an energy problem of global significance. That is the threshold we may have crossed. From here, every additional week matters, every shipping update matters, every production adjustment matters, and every signal about whether this conflict is narrowing or widening matters. Because once oil starts moving on physical disruption instead of pure headline fear, the consequences travel far beyond the trading screen. They show up in budgets, they show up in inflation data, they show up in politics, they show up in business confidence, and eventually they show up in daily life. So the real story is not just that oil briefly hit $119. The real story is why. A longer than hoped war, a vital export corridor under pressure, a major producer already cutting output, and a global market trying to decide whether this is the peak of the panic or the beginning of a much tougher stretch ahead. That is the story investors are trying to price. That is the story governments are trying to manage. And that is the story the rest of the world may soon start to feel more directly. If the next few days bring de-escalation and safer shipping conditions, this could ease. But if the disruption lasts and more barrels get trapped behind bottlenecks, the consequences will not stay confined to oil traders and policy briefings. They will move outward into the broader economy. And that is why this moment deserves attention without exaggeration. Because the warning is already visible in the price, in the timeline, and in the barrels that Iraq has already had to take offline.